day of the conference, especially as it's Saturday, to log in. So I think you're aware that we're going to share just a snapshot really of some of the initial findings of the BALEAP funded research we're currently working on. And we hope to whet your appetite ahead of the publication, which should be out in May. And before we get going, I'd just like to say thank you to those who participated in the research, and of course to BALEAP for funding the project. Next slide, Heléna, please. So I'll just share a quotation from an article which was published in the USA by Hodges et al. On March the 27th, 2020. And at that time, as you know, day by day, more institutions were moving to remote instruction. So I'll just give you a moment to take a quick look at that. So basically the purpose of the article was to provide some clear distinctions to inform sort of evaluation and reflection that the authors knew would result from this mass move to remote learning, and to tell educators not to compare their current remote delivery to face-to-face learning. Next slide. And it's sort of this kind of reflection and evaluation which has prompted BALEAP to put out a call for proposals to investigate the impact of COVID on the UK EAP sector. And the call included the first 2 research questions, which you can see on the slide. So looking at the changes to delivery and operations. And then Heléna and I added the 3rd one to provide more of an evaluative and personal perspective to the factual data which was going to be generated from the first 2 questions.
So as we speak today, it's important to remember that everything that we report on happened in this crazy COVID-19 situation. And that's really what makes the success and everything that everybody did all the greater. So we'll talk a little bit about the research design, who was involved, our data analysis approach. Then we'll give you a little snapshot of the analysis so far in terms of operations and delivery, and then just some thoughts on where we go from here. We used a mixed methods approach. BALEAP was keen to have quantitative data, so we designed an online questionnaire. And we disseminated that in December 2020 through social media, through the BALEAP mailing list, and with the help of our friends. And then we conducted 14 semi-structured interviews. We got responses from people in a range of roles, mostly teachers. And we were delighted to see that we had representatives of 63 different UK universities and 8 UK EAP providers. So that really gave us a good overview. Of the interviews, we wanted to hear mostly from the teachers because, as one teacher said, they were the ones at the Zoom face in all of this. But we also heard from coordinators, managers, administrators, one subject lead and one curriculum developer. Thank you to all of you. Our data analysis, we were really able to kind of benefit from being a team here. We did collaborative data analysis where we were able to create our codes together. And we just took descriptive statistics in terms of the quantitative data from the questionnaires. So what did we find out? Well, we found out that most people saw a drop in numbers of students last year, 74%. And some of the interviews gave us some insight into kind of how substantial this drop was. So one administrator said their numbers actually halved, and another manager said they took a real punch going from 900 to 550. So that unfortunately was the general trend. When it comes to registration, a lot of people, 33%, felt that not too much really changed, because we think that a lot of people were doing a lot of their registration online already. whereas 43% said that the process did become more difficult. And we can see some of the insights here from one manager who was explaining that students were registering just later and later, obviously waiting to see what was going to happen. And because students were registering late, that means they were often doing a test once they got onto the course, getting the score that they needed and dropping out. And this made it really difficult for managers to manage the student-teacher ratios. Another administrator mentioned, she said, we did have management saying, how many students have you got? And I'd go, well, that's a good question, isn't it? I wasn't really sure who was there and who not. So this kind of invisibility online as well did create problems. But a lot of people said that their online registration was very successful and that probably they wouldn't go back to face-to-face. In terms of communication, of course, the main challenge that came through with online communication was the internet and connectivity problems. 103 people mentioned this. Also the Chinese firewall, which was particularly problematic with institutions' VLEs, which then meant that a lot of people moved to Teams and Zoom as a consequence. And there did seem to be some kind of struggle that came across between institutions or IT departments and EAP teams, where the institution was kind of insisting on the VLE and the EAP teams were wanting to use Teams or Zoom. That's what they felt they preferred. Some people also said there was just too many platforms, and what this often resulted in was just an overload of communication. There was communication coming from everywhere. Some people felt that the students didn't manage to get everything and they didn't manage to receive everything. Also because of the timing. So not only was communication coming at you from several different places, but also at different times of the day, because of everybody being in different time zones. And this created problems around expectations, with students expecting responses at all times of the day and night. Also, people mentioned how difficult it was to create rapport online, particularly when there was a lack of cameras, and we can all see that well-known black wall of initials on Teams there. And also a lack of chit chat, the informal communication, which sometimes resulted in miscommunication as well. So there were many different strategies employed that we can, share with you and build upon. And these strategies clearly did have some success, because 80% of participants felt that online communication was successful in the end. And different strategies that were used included making sure that people had minimum technology requirements in terms of hardware, software, and internet connection. That there was an increased amount of communication, additional meetings, etc. That people worked in small groups, whether that meant small classes with students and also small staff groups headed by a coordinator. Informal communication opportunities had to be created, and sometimes this was through social events or creating staff rooms on Teams, for example. Social media played a part of this, and we can see 23% down there actually used things like WhatsApp in order to facilitate that kind of informal communication between staff and students. Some people put in kind of rules around when to expect responses and when their working hours were. And also people tried to make a clear distinction between what software was for what purpose. And this kind of helped. So there were lots of opportunities that came out of this online communication, and the main one that 50 people mentioned was how it made communication faster and easier, much easier to grab somebody said, when you're communicating on Teams, for example. And this came into the logistics of things as well. meetings and ceremonies that weren't possible face-to-face because of room bookings, room size, suddenly became possible online. So that's something that people feel they could really capitalize on. Some people felt also there was improved communication amongst staff and amongst students. People were thinking more clearly about what they wrote, and people said also students' writing skills improved. And really this important matter of shared practice. So some people felt for the first time they were able to access training, CPD, social activities, because usually they couldn't, what with childcare, travel, and just the logistics and the cost of things. So shared practice became accessible to a lot of people online. Okay, to Emma.
Okay, I'm going to share just a few findings about design and delivery. And our interview data generated a theme which Heléna and I were labeling emergency EAP, or I think we had initial contingency measures. And it wasn't until we read the Hodges article, which I mentioned at the start of the presentation, and I think at this point it was already January and we were immersed in our analysis, that we became aware, maybe we were last to the party, but of the term emergency remote teaching, or ERT. But what we found was that the distinction presented here on the slide between ERT and effective online learning really corroborated our analysis. I'm sure you're all familiar with the terminology. It's been mentioned a lot during the conference. And I think an important word in the definition of ERT on the slide is temporary. So the main aim is to continue instruction. And if this aim has been achieved, then it's been successful. However, you can see from their definition of online learning, that includes the words careful and systematic. Our data span the initial 6-month period after lockdown and include many different solutions to remote EAP provision. But it seems that the difference between ERT and online learning is more of a continuum than a binary distinction. And it does depend, of course, on the timeline. So, for example, maybe some people had to rush to provide that uninterrupted instruction to students who were already partway through a course when we went into lockdown, compared to a pre-sessional beginning in late summer. And as well as the time frame, the data show that many other contextual factors, obviously resources, size of the cohort, learning objectives, the underlying teaching philosophy, all of these things shaped the design and the effectiveness of the remote delivery. Next slide, Heléna, please. So I'll just share, first of all, a soundbite from an interviewee, which is a manager who's rationalizing the approach to her teachers. And I love this one. I'm going to read it to you. So I used to say this to teachers all the time. This isn't an online course. This is an emergency conversion done at great speed with no skill and no knowledge of what we're doing. I think it's really important to remember that in any reflections of what happened and what was good and bad. We're not talking about a finely honed, researched, informed approach to online learning driven by passionate individuals. That's not what happened. And I think the message here is there's no point beating yourself up. By continuing instruction, the ERT was achieving its main aim. And I'm sure that's really familiar to so many of you. But what really does come out of the data is the opportunity for growth, for creativity, and for doing things differently. And even though our research did only cover that initial 6-month period, it was a period of massive development and upskilling, and so many lessons were learned. And participants involved in more than one program during this period provide evidence of this in practice. And so the second quote that you can see here is from a coordinator, and I'll just let you have a quick read of that one if you haven't already. So she presents a real distinction between the early ERT, or as she puts it, the oh my God phase, and what she then calls the online course, which was later in the summer, and it benefited from the lessons learned. It included less synchronous face-to-face instruction, and it was no doubt further along that continuum towards the online learning end. Let's have a look at the next slide. So, as I said, the unique context of each provider offered varying parameters and opportunities, which resulted in so many different solutions. And they ranged from complete course redesign in some cases, just to quite small amendments to existing materials in other cases. But you can see from the table that across all courses, synchronous or face-to-face live sessions, whether with the whole class or one-on-one, were a really popular mode. But there were massive differences in regard to how much synchronous instruction. And this ranged from the same number of live hours as had previously been done in the classroom to a vastly reduced number with a really, really heavy asynchronous component. So Helena's just clicking through a few of the models there. That's it. Okay. So the last one is the one I want to focus on. This is really interesting. So 45 minutes a week with the whole class and an individual tutorial of 20 minutes. This was taken from a pre-sessional, and this was my most positive interviewee. And she had been really skeptical, as she'd worked on the same pre-sessional for years, and she was really apprehensive about online learning, about online teaching. But she said it was one of the best experiences ever. If you just click forward, Heléna. So you can see a comment here from her interview. So all the asynchronous tasks, well, most of them were collaborative, and students didn't feel shortchanged. And I found this really enlightening, because the participant with the least synchronous provision of all seemed to have such a successful pre-sessional. And when I analysed this, what I found was that it really was, it seemed to be a proper flipped learning approach. So if we go to the next slide. So with reference to this definition of flipped learning that you can see, and just bear in mind that this definition was written to define the approach when learning in the physical space was the norm. All of the participant that I'm talking about, all of the direct instruction had moved away from the group space to the remote space, but this tended to be done collaboratively rather than individually, as in the definition. And if that's it, here we go. So if we just look at another quote from this teacher, I'll let you have a quick look. So she's explaining how her role changed. So she was getting the students together for a weekly meeting rather than teaching, and she was really glad she wasn't expected to try and replicate being in a classroom. So going back to that definition, she was definitely a guide. She was monitoring the asynchronous tasks, and she was facilitating that weekly meeting. And what I found is that her institution offered their 4-week pre-sessional reasonably late in the summer. So they did have some time compared to others to do research, to prepare. And this resulted in a program that was more towards the online learning end of the continuum. And the course coordinators followed a really principled approach to course design. They drew heavily on Gilly Salmon's 5-stage model. You can see the book there, the sequenced activities, starting from the basics of training students to learn the tech, and then promoting a really learner-centered, collaborative, task-based approach to online learning. So if we look at the next slide, over 3/4 of respondents reported following a flipped learning approach, but we don't know if they all have the same understanding of what flipped learning is. Some mention really innovative, kind of interactive learning objects, but others relied on scanned documents. And the data really exemplify effective approaches and much less effective ones. And I'm going to share 3 of the most prevalent challenges that came up, and there were many challenges. We haven't got time, obviously, to report on too many here. So the first one, clearly student engagement or motivation. It was mentioned 55 times in the questionnaire. And you can see a couple of the responses. So the bare minimum in the asynchronous prep, and then another one, taking these good study skills and maturity. Okay, and then, yep, let's go to the next slide. So 2 more challenges. So the first one was mentioned in the design and delivery section of the questionnaire by 39 respondents. And this was actually what we just covered, was the changing role of the teacher, and in some cases a lack of confidence. And the quote here from the coordinator says that the teachers became facilitators of discussion. They had to keep a discussion going for an hour. So I guess there was an element of feeling like maybe a lack of control compared to what they'd used to have. Another challenge was the quality of the asynchronous materials, mentioned by 37 respondents. So difficult to navigate, or the poor quality meant that they didn't compensate for the missed live lesson time. Yeah, and next slide. Okay, so briefly just want to mention opportunities. There were so many, some very, very positive comments coming through. So enhanced student autonomy, upskilling of teachers, the maximizing of the class time because there's no need to do input and controlled practice, easier to teach difficult content as this had been covered in the asynchronous materials, a catalyst for work which was already on the development agenda. And then what I'd like to finish with before I hand back to Heléna is just a lovely comment here reflecting the pitfalls which could have arisen without flipped learning. So if you just have a quick look at that. Really strongly worded one. All right, thank you.
Okay, so moving forward, where do we go from here? Well, our last question on the questionnaire asked people what they would like in terms of the mode going forwards. And you can see that fully online was the least preferred. But interestingly, 71.4% of people said they would like to see a blended approach going forward. Obviously, we don't know what people understand by blended because it means different things to different people. But it does indicate that people want to maybe harness the opportunities that have come out of this online learning and take it back with them when they move face to face. Obviously for this year, perhaps these three choices were not the question that we need to be asking, but whether people want to be doing fully online or the hybrid approach with some students online and some face-to-face, or face-to-face in a COVID secure classroom. And it is worth noting that fears around hybrid teaching did come out quite strongly in the data and in the interviews particularly, and also when people were asked whether they'd prefer to teach face-to-face in a COVID secure classroom with the distance in the masks and not sharing materials, or online, people said they'd prefer the online side because it was more flexible, particularly for collaborative activities. So to summarize, I think what really comes out of the research is all of your resilience, how you made this happen despite all the challenges, and how everybody kind of worked as a community. Yes, there were negative sides that came out of the data, but really strongly came through this sense of community, and that everybody is kind of excited to see where this goes forward together. So thank you, and here are our references. I'll stop sharing.